Biblical Judeo-Christian notions abound in The Mandalorian. I'll be right back. Welcome, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from thegraciousguest.org here with you today for another episode of The Gracious Guest Show, one that I'm particularly excited about, something a little different than what we typically do around here, so I hope you'll stay around. Before you do anything, though, please subscribe to this channel. Please like and share this content far and wide with someone that you think will get something out of this today, and this, I think, is a really good example of what this channel really can do, and what I'm trying to do here on the channel with my different presentations and interviews primarily. In this case, what we're looking at is an intersection of faith and culture as seen through just the experience of the hit show The Mandalorian, which has just completed its third season at the time of this recording. And as many of you are aware, I'm a regular panelist and host on The Secrets of Star Wars, which is a Star Quest Production Network, or SQPN program. They have a lot of awesome shows over there. I put some links below for you to check out. And I've been doing that for a couple of years with some good friends I've made over the last couple of years there. And what we really do is this kind of thing pretty much all the time. We unpack specifically Christian themes, Catholic themes in particular, in various Star Wars installments across the whole Star Wars galaxy, all the different shows and TV shows and movies, and sometimes we get into stuff like some of the written works and comics and that kind of stuff, and we just have a lot of fun over there with that show. And we've been doing breakdowns of episode by episode considerations for this Mandalorian Season 3, like we did with the first two seasons. And, sometimes it's fun, though, to kind of look at it as a whole, a season as a whole later on, and to step back and really look at some of these deeper themes, and that's what that show attempts to really do. But my good friend Thomas Salerno, who himself is an SQPN regular, but on some different shows. He's usually on Secrets of Middle-earth. He's been on Secrets of movies and TV shows over there. Thomas is also a huge Star Wars fan, and Thomas and I regularly have these conversations that kind of hover around some of these different themes. So even though it's not in the official Secrets of Star Wars kind of setting, we were talking about it and thought it would be really cool to kind of come on here on this show and kind of unpack some of this. And so we've titled this Mandalorian Discipleship. And the more we talked about it, I think you're going to see it was really, really interesting how it really kind of just jumped from one thing to the other and everything really connected. And there's so many potential connections with our Catholic faith and with really the Jewish Old Testament, right? Kind of biblical motifs that really show up throughout the show. And it's really kind of cool. Thomas himself also, as a freelance writer, does a lot of different work. He has a wonderful podcast called The Perilous Realms, where he focuses on a lot of the intersections of faith and literature, a lot of especially with the Tolkien legendarium. Tolkien comes up a little bit in this show here as well today, but I have a bunch of links below you're definitely going to want to check out. Also, to make sure you don't forget to pick up a copy, I have it right back here, of a book Thomas has recently edited and contributed to from Voyage Comics called The Christ Bearer, exploring the connection between the Mandalorian and Christian saints, especially some of the various legends surrounding St. Christopher and also St. Joseph. So without further ado, I want to jump in here to Gracious Guest Show regular and my good friend Thomas Salerno here to talk about Mandalorian Discipleship. Check it out. Thomas Salerno, you're back in the guest seat on the Gracious Guest Show. Thanks for coming back.
Glad to be here once again, Mike. I'm sure we'll have a blast, as always.
Well, and I feel like this one's been a long time coming topically, so to speak, in a couple different ways. So we've had, the fiction of Ray Bradbury. We've had dinosaurs. We've touched on a couple things, Tolkien, and we'll touch on him a little bit here at the outset. But, we've been talking about this for a while, this various themes in The Mandalorian, and while you're not specifically involved within SQPN, with specifically the Secrets of Star Wars show. I mean, I'm on there as a panelist and a host sometimes. You're of course involved with the Secrets of Middle-earth. And I think, have you done some Secrets of movies and TV shows in there too? I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So we're of course in the same wheelhouse of geek culture and film and all that kind of stuff and faith. But we haven't had a chance to cross paths like this with some of these themes, and And to be fair, some of these themes are in general have come up on the Secrets of Star Wars, so I want to give a shout out to those guys, and I'll have the links below. But I just thought this would be a neat chance. We've been talking, and then you filled up this Google Doc here with some awesome stuff for us to unpack. But I wanted to kick it off here first with just, for fans of The Mandalorian who saw season 3, and especially fans who are of the sort of Tolkien crowd as well, for what it's worth, I had noticed a few things that just jumped out at me that I wanted to bring up and just get your thoughts on. And just 3 we had thrown out here. And I thought we'd just kick off with these and then move in more to the specific connection between Mandalorians and some of these themes, not just in season 3, but the whole show, and some real biblical themes that we're going to unpack here tonight. But first things first, with Tolkien, we've got Mandalore as Moria,
Right.
the dark saber as Arkenstone ? And Gideon as Smaug. And so all I wanted to mention about these was just, from the outset of season 3, especially once we hit episode 2 there, the Mines of Moria, and my wife was watching it with me. We were doing that this year. I was good about somehow waiting until nighttime to watch it. Normally I watch it at like 4 or 5 in the morning. Like super early. Yeah. And so my wife was interested in watching it this year with me to get the first reaction. So I was deleting YouTube off my phone and stuff like on Wednesdays and all this, but I didn't have any spoilers. But even from episode 2, like he's going down there with Grogu, they're going into the depths of like the ruins and everything. And she was like, it's Moria. It's Mines of Moria. and we totally had that Moria vibe, from that. All the way up till the end. So did you get that impression there too? Did you get that feel?
It's funny. That specific one, for whatever reason, didn't fire in my brain when I saw it the first time. I definitely see it now that you mention it. They're going down into specifically mines.
Right.
They're, Beskar is almost like Mithril.
Right.
In a way. And there's all these monsters down there, like that. If these Tolkien connections are in any way deliberate, I wouldn't be surprised, because from all I've heard, Dave Filoni, who's heavily involved in The Mandalorian, is a huge Tolkien fan.
I wouldn't be surprised.
He's constantly peppering Tolkien references in pretty much any Star Wars project he's involved in. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if we're meant to see these connections.
Well, and it's just funny in the Arkenstone thing with the dark side. That's kind of probably the biggest stretch, but that came to mind just because and I've been talking to you about this. I've been rereading / listening to in audiobook form, specifically the Andy Serkis version for the first time, the Hobbit audiobook.
Yeah.
And which is just so great. And the whole Arkenstone thing, it's just interesting, this idea of this really specific treasure that's just so meaningful, but perhaps even meaningful to an exaggerated level, right? Like how much is riding on this one thing. And it's now, within Tolkien's legendarium, there's clearly, when you read that in light of the Lord of the Rings, which of course he wrote later, fleshing out how, like, the depth of the power of the ring, which wasn't really there that much, right? Of course, in the Hobbit, you can't help but, of course, get that little feeling of like a foreshadowing of this all-consuming precious, in the form of the Arkenstone. And while I don't really think you have quite the same thing, right, with anyone getting like addicted to the dark saber and like sitting there staring at it, like I would if I got a replica of it, which who knows now that the thing's broken. But there was, to me, that sense of like so much of the end of season 2, or even the middle of season 2, right? When he first meets Bo-Katan and she's starting to talk about this quest to get back the Darksaber, and then not being able to get it because someone else has it, and how much that puts this cloud over her, almost kind of in a Thorin kind of way. Again, it wasn't quite exactly the same, but I just thought that was really intriguing. This idea of this treasure, how important is it really?
I think it might even go deeper than Tolkien, because I think that the Arkenstone and, artifacts like the Darksaber, I think both take their cue from the Grail myth. That they are this artifact of immense power that people desire for different reasons. and and are always seeking for, and to have it give some sort of authority. I really think that in a lot of fantasy, and if you include Star Wars generally as a fantasy set in outer space, it's gonna have a lot of these common motifs and references that we see throughout legends and mythology going back thousands of years, and the Grail motif keeps popping up, and I think that both the Arkenstone and the Darksaber really feed off of that.
Sure. Yeah, well, and that, of course, and then there wasn't really a treasure hoard per se, but the Gideon and Smaug thing, he just kind of looked like, he had horns, and I don't know. There was just this, here's this. He's lurking down here in this place that used to be their home, and he's stolen it and made it his own, and he's using their treasure is the Beskar.
Metaphorically, he is the dragon they have to defeat.
Right.
He serves the same sort of archetypical purpose in the story,
right?
That Smaug does, or Fafnir, or any of the or Grendel, or any of the famous,
right?
Monsters or dragons. Whether they look like traditional dragons or not. In fact, that's funny because I've been reading a book recently. It's the Penguin Book of Dragons, put out by Penguin Classics, and it is an anthology of dragon legends and dragon myths from pretty much from the classical period through the modern times.
That would be interesting.
There's a whole section on Byzantine dragon myths from the Byzantine Empire. And it's interesting because Byzantine dragons are also shapeshifters and can take many forms. They don't always look like traditional dragons. They can sometimes look more like people, or more like what we in the West would think of as a troll. A lot of these monsters that in the West are so clearly defined as separate monsters, in the Orient and in the East, that's not necessarily the case.
Interesting.
There's not this clear-cut line between, in at least Byzantine mythology, between what's a dragon and what's a troll.
Right.
There's this kind of area where they both blend into kind of sort of the same monster. So yeah, it's like,
wow,
that motif of the dragon, the final boss that you have to defeat at the end of the level,
Bowser, right?
Bowser, another dragon. I definitely think Gideon falls into that. Absolutely.
Well, and that's a potentially an awesome bridge over to our main kind of focus here. This more biblical, these biblical motifs, because I that gets me thinking, of course, about the dragon, where and again, anyone
and mythosaurs too.
Well, right,
dragons,
right. and anybody watching this that has anything to do with Trinity High School, where I teach at, please no offense meant here whatsoever, but our house system has different mascots. We've kind of a house, like a Harry Potter almost kind of house system, and I'm in Seton House, and I don't know who. To be fair, I don't know whose idea it was. I don't know what the reasoning was, but for some reason, Seton House's mascot is a red dragon. And as a theology teacher, I'm always like uncomfortable with like the only biblical reference of a red dragon in scripture is Satan.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't really know about this. I always feel a little weird about like this kid running around in a giant plush dragon costume as like the mascot and stuff. I'm like, okay, but that aside, it's certainly, when you think of scripture and you think of the serpent, and my understanding is I don't speak Hebrew or read it or anything, but just in my studies, my understanding is that the term for serpent in Genesis is not, like an adder or like a garter snake. Like it's a more nefarious kind of creature. It has, that imagery of dragon. There's supernatural things in the background here with what exactly that is. Is it the devil in some kind of form that they're seeing? Is it how much of it's, oral tradition, very figurative language versus what it looked like on the ground, all those kinds of questions aside, we certainly see that that's an interesting idea of the shape shifting. I wonder if that ends up in some of that literature that you're mentioning there with some kind of, biblical connection there specifically.
Oh, I think so, yeah. And I think even in the Book of Dragons that I was reading, they even bring up that point. That
Oh,
because
okay.
because they include what is it, Genesis 3,
Mm-hmm.
I think, with the serpent in the garden. They include that passage from the Bible as a
Okay.
dragon story. Because
Sure.
they bring up that point that you mentioned, that in Hebrew, any slithering reptile, could be considered a dragon, and when what we translate as serpent, we tend to think of as snake, but like in especially in like the Hebrew oral tradition, and I understand there's some connection between that and Leviathan from the Book of Job.
Yeah.
That there's also some linguistic connection there.
And I've heard crocodiles suggested too, and it gets a
Right.
little.
It
And I
gets
mean,
a little murky, like, because like I don't think in the ancient world there were, the Linnaean classification system for animals
right,
hadn't come around yet, and I don't think they made a
right,
whole lot of distinctions between the different reptiles. If you have
right,
scales and you slither about on the ground or in the water and lay eggs, you're a dragon. That's just what you are.
right. And that's even like Tolkien's usage of the worm
The
sometimes to refer to
worm, yeah,
Smaug, right?
yeah.
Which I was just looking here, sort of an etymologically, kind of an archaic description of a sometimes wingless dragon, or a
Right.
sea serpent, right? So even in Rings of Power, whatever your opinion was of that show, I'm just saying, they referred to that the worm was the sea monster, in that one
Right, yeah.
segment too that you
which
briefly see.
which then, even in our modern time, the famous lake monster of Scotland, Nessie, is
Mm.
sometimes referred to as the Orm,
Mm-hmm.
ORM, which is etymologically connected to
Right.
worm. It's kind of from
Right.
the same tradition.
And by the way, I'm a fan of. I don't know if you ever saw the 13th Warrior. Did you ever see that with Antonio Banderas?
Yes, based on the
I
Michael Crichton
Yeah.
novel Eaters of the Dead.
Right, and
Right.
to be, maybe this is blasphemous of me, but I kind of enjoy the movie more than the book, but just
Yeah,
because it's
yeah.
condensed.
hmm
But and that's a neat story too. It's not exactly a children's book. Let me just be clear. The book version of it's pretty graphic, in a couple immoral ways,
That's
but
Michael
the
Crichton for you.
right, yeah, but who is one of my favorite authors, but modern authors at least. But the fire firm, they have the guys, the Norsemen. It's like they
Right.
woke up to the glow firm, which is just it's basically, spoiler alert, it's the rival cannibal tribe coming down the mountain with torches, and it looks like this really creepy, like fiery serpent coming down.
Mm.
I always remember that scene, but well, there's a couple connections here, but why don't we go ahead and jump into some of these, like you said. Do you want to set the stage here, Thomas, a little bit with I don't know how you want to do this with, do you want to talk about the book maybe first, or might as well
Yes,
introduce this?
I think
I
that's
have
a
it up
good
on the screen.
segue, because so me and a bunch of other authors who write for the Voyage Comics website,
Love that
we put
image. Look at
together, yeah,
that.
we put together a little anthology called The Christ Bearer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is an interesting book because it's an anthology both of previously published material that's kind of like in the public domain about saint legends, about saints like Saint Christopher and Saint Joseph. And in the original essays that we've written to accompany these stories, we try and pull out the connections between Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, and some of these saints, especially because he has such a connection to Grogu, who is a child, and both Saints Christopher and Saint Joseph are associated with children,
Right.
specifically the Christ child. Christopher, Christ bearer. According to legend, he had an apparition of the Christ child who he carries along with him, much like Din Djarin carries Grogu. And of course, Saint Joseph cared for the child Jesus. We know this from the historical gospels, that he
Right.
was the foster father, the caregiver of the child Jesus. But it was interesting because I chose in my essay not to write about either of these figures, because I knew there were plenty of other authors in the anthology who were going to do a marvelous job with that. Instead, I wanted to focus on the connections between Mandalorian culture and biblical Jewish culture.
Right.
So my essay was specifically about the parable of the Good Samaritan. because because we all know that the Book of Boba Fett is basically Mandalorian season 2.5.
Right.
And because we get a lot of character development for Din Djarin.
Yeah.
And in his episodes where he is essentially excommunicated from his Mandalorian covert, I felt that there was a lot of connections there between a kind of, at least the way his covert interpreted Mandalorian law, as kind of a Pharisaical point of view.
Sure.
Because yes, Din Djarin, as we know from season 2 of The Mandalorian, was forced to remove his helmet in order to access that computer terminal so that he could verify the the Imperial ship on which Grogu's being held.
Right.
So he does this in order to save a life, an innocent life. And yet he's still excommunicated from the covert. This is still seen as sinful by the armorer and the other Mandalorians in his community. They call him an apostate, and they excommunicate him. And I felt that, to me, and I have no clue if this was intentional on the part of the writers, that immediately brought to my mind not only the parable of the Good Samaritan, where both a priest and a Levite pass by an innocent victim on the roadside so that they don't ritually contaminate themselves. It also reminded me, as I bring up in the essay, the famous incident where Jesus heals the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And he asks the Pharisees who are present, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or not? And they won't answer the question. So he does it anyway. And it says they immediately went out and started plotting to kill him. So he displayed, not only does he save an innocent life by healing someone, he displays divine power. And yet they're like, but you have violated our interpretation of the law. You must die.
Yeah.
And so like there's this kind of rigid, legalistic way where the law becomes a straitjacket.
Right.
Instead of a vehicle to move us to greater love of the other.
Yeah.
That, I just felt that, and especially now in season 3 that we have the Mandalorians coming together despite their, I guess we can say, doctrinal differences.
Right.
And working together and not excommunicating or viewing one another as heretics anymore. I just felt that motif of the law and of creed and how you interpret these things, it struck me in such a immediate way that I felt I just had to, as soon as I knew we were putting this book together, I'm like, I know what I'm writing about.
Yeah. That's such a great point. Yeah, because I was just talking about this with students a couple weeks ago, not the Mandalorian connection, but it seems to me that it's like this clear demonstration of a misunderstanding of the means in the end, right? Mm-hmm. It's not about that, some people interpret it sometimes as, Jesus came to just say that rules aren't important. It's like, no, that's not, right. That's not the point. The point is the rule isn't the goal line. Like, mm-hmm. like the rule is how the parameters to help you run the race, but there will be a time when that's done, right. And that seems to be what Jesus is really clarifying. Like, and he makes a distinction, right? Like the 10 Commandments don't go anywhere because those are, you could say, characteristic in some ways of God himself or direct relationship with him and with others, that have to be present and always will be if you're in line with grace. But, to see the law of Moses, especially, right? Those provisions, was it 613, I think of them or something like that, to see those as basically like, that's God, as opposed to the law God gives us to bring us to him, is the thing that enables them to see God at work, or reveling sort of in this beautiful act on the Sabbath day, which is meant for, stepping back to pay attention to God and to be thankful to God. And they miss that right in front of them.
And it's funny because, like, from the Mandalorian coverts, for the Children of the Watch, from that faction's point of view, I can see why they put so much emphasis on not removing your helmet in public or in front of anyone, really. And because they view it as essential to their identity. They're like, this is how, like, you know, again, almost like, you know, the way especially European Jews, you know, have, you know, Orthodox Jews view themselves as living in among the nations, among in a Gentile context, you know, as being kind of a people apart, you know, chosen by God, you know, and they keep to the law of Moses because it is what God has prescribed for them. And I think they view themselves, we're living in a hostile galaxy where people don't like or understand us. By wearing these helmets, we are saying up front, we are Mandalorians. We make no apologies for ourselves or for our culture. You know, kind of in the way how, like, you know, Christians are also called to live in the world, but not be of the world, you know.
Right.
And while we don't have dietary laws or laws of dress really that mark us apart from other people, I believe it is somewhere in the New Testament that the Gentiles, you might say, you know, the nations should know you by your love. Your love for other people as Christians should be a marker that where someone could look at your life and say that person's a Christian. You know, and we often have to keep coming back to that and really do an examination of conscience and say, am I living a life where someone, knowing nothing else about me, would look at my life and say, yeah, that person's a Christian?
Right. Well, and you know, I'm just looking at some of the, like, we have so many cool things here we could kind of go into here. You know, that again, that identity, when it is so fixed on a particular location or a particular way of doing things, it's so easily thrown into complete disarray when that thing disappears. Like, oh, I don't know, your planet, which of course, and you had mentioned this, you know, before with Jon Favreau, just based on our sort of research and what we've heard here, not necessarily knowing 100% with certainty here about where he stands religiously in terms of worldview, but, you know, there have been various, you know, sort of references to him having Jewish ancestry, at least, you know, Jewish identity to some degree,
coming out
and
of
also
a Jewish context,
right, Jewish context, Jewish biblical or a Judeo-Christian biblical worldview. And as you said before we started here too, I wanted to get into this a little bit. I think you made a good case for, and maybe you could share it here with the audience. George Lucas himself, you know, coming from, my understanding is I think a Methodist framework growing up, certainly at least marginally familiar with the kind of Protestant Christian kind of categories of things, then an interest in Eastern thought, some Buddhism, famously kind of crafting the Jedi Order as this kind of quasi, you know, Christian religious order meets Buddhist, you know,
meets
kind
like
of
Taoist,
order, Taoist. Yes, it's sort of a hodgepodge. But what's something else in particular here that jumps out at you from Favreau's approach here specifically to a very kind of clearly, seemingly here, you know, Jewish Old Testament motif, you know, some element here when it connects with the Mandalorian's plight?
Yeah, definitely two things kind of, especially this season, leapt out at me immediately. One is this profound sense of exile from the land. The Mandalorians seem to view Mandalore in the way the biblical Jewish people, and even in modern times with the Zionist movement, view the land of Israel. That this is the land that God promised them through their ancestor Abraham, and it's somehow bound up with them in a very deep identity sort of way. This is their land, this is their inheritance. You know?
And even if I might, even when it's been chewed up and spit out or completely like
Yes.
wrecked, or it would be the easiest thing in the world would be to move on and just pick somewhere
Right.
else to go. There's something about the location that's urgently critical, no matter what shape it's in.
Yeah, and when it's at some point in this season, Din Djarin says, "Our people are scattered like stars in the galaxy," and I'm like, that sounds right out. Except for the galaxy part, that sounds right out of the Psalms.
Right.
You know, specifically the Psalms having to deal with the exile.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. The laments and
the laments. You know,
yeah.
you can almost hear Din Djarin almost saying, you know, by the waters of Babylon, they told us, sing us a song of Mandalore or something, along those lines. You're like, they're in a sort of Babylonian exile. You know, they are scattered. The lost tribes of Israel. You know, that, and the fact that there are different factions, early on in
that weakened them.
Yes.
So
like
that
Israel
crushing could happen.
Mm-hmm.
It was prophesied that they would be crushed if they couldn't,
they couldn't reconcile.
Like,
and so you have the kind of mainstream Mandalorians represented by Bo-Katan. And you have, and her night owls and her group. And then you have the Children of the Watch who, represent this more sort of, very conservative, very, even more than Death Watch was.
Yeah.
Clone Wars.
Right.
And they say it's because we didn't keep to our law that the purge happened.
Right.
Which is which that could almost be right. That's right out of the playbook of the Pharisees.
Right.
Where it's like the Messiah will come if we are scrupulously observant of the law.
That's even in The Chosen, that first season when Nicodemus is addressing the whole fishing on Shabbat thing. And he says, make no mistake, the Messiah will not come as long as we are fishing on Shabbat. And it's like,
right. Yeah.
Oh, maybe you might want to look. It's like, Nick, you might want to look again. So, no.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
It's right over there. No.
And it's like, it's interesting because like the Mandalorians themselves seem to be steeped also in prophecy. There are no named Mandalorian prophets, but they're constantly talking about how, like, when the mythosaur rises, it is a sign that we will be returning to Mandalore. And this whole idea of Mandalore as the sort of site where atonement can be had. There's a lot about atonement in this season, which reminded me of both, Christian baptism, obviously, but also the Jewish temple.
Right.
Because in the book of Boba Fett, when Din Djarin is expelled from the covert, they're like, well, you've broken the law by removing your helmet. The only way you can be redeemed is by washing in the sacred waters of the mines of Mandalore. And at that point, they believe the mines have been destroyed. And they're like, well, then there's just no way you're redeemed. Sorry.
Right.
And it reminds me of, like, when the first the Babylonians, but then later the Romans sack and destroy the Second Temple. That is a body blow to the Jewish people. That is the place of their they then have to reorient their entire theology of atonement.
Well, and I think a lot of people don't think about that because, to be fair, I think most people aren't Jewish, and most people
we're not
probably
Jewish.
don't know probably many Jewish people, or they, just people aren't familiar with it. But like the little, I've been blessed through sort of my study of our faith to learn the Jewish roots more and more, but also blessed with some very dear Jewish friends who have kind of welcomed us into various aspects of their world. And, it's something like, I don't think anyone can really, none of us can comprehend the magnitude of, like, you have this, like, not just your religion that we think of in a kind of our secular West here of like, well, that's just part of your life. No, it is your life. Like, it's everything.
Life, yeah.
And it's like, and it completely revolves around the temple in Jerusalem. Right. It's a location-based, atonement-based faith where, how you are made right with God, how your sins are forgiven is by ritual sacrifice at the temple.
Right.
And now there is no temple. It's
now
gone.
there is no temple. Just like
And
there
I
is
think-
no Mandalore. Yeah.
Right. So how do so like they gradually over thousands of years morphed into various factions and sects and stuff within Judaism, of course. But, if you have Jewish friends who go to the synagogue, and have these various rituals and really like study the Torah, yes. But, I think some people just don't understand how different that is than what it was.
And what it used to be. Yeah.
For thousands of years.
And I just want to point out here, this is a little bit of a segue, but I'm like going to get on my soapbox for a second, that I really think that one of the really entrenched recurring heresies is Marcionism, which is the heresy that says Judaism really has nothing to do with Christianity. That's old hat. It's really not connected.
Wrong.
The old every time you hear someone say, I prefer the New Testament God to the Old Testament God, that's Marcionism.
Yeah.
Like it's one and the same God. And Brant Petrie has written several fantastic books about the Jewish roots of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I know Bishop Robert Barron has spoken a lot on it. And it really got me motivated to read through the entire Old Testament, which I finally did thanks to the Father Mike Schmidt's lovely Bible in a Year podcast. I followed along with that, and I finally made it through, and I made it through all the various repetitions of, I think it's in Leviticus, of blue and purple and scarlet stuff, describing all the various hangings in the tabernacle and whatnot. But and again, a little bit
how
of
to
a segue,
sacrifice the goat.
How to sacrifice.
Like, okay.
My brother pointed out to me that he's like, before this was written down, this was all oral tradition, and repetition is important for oral tradition. So like when people say, oh, the Old Testament is repetitive and stupid, I'm like, it's because it's coming out of this oral tradition before it was ever written down, before the Hebrew alphabet was even invented. They're having to constantly do this kind of rhythmic, lyrical repetition of the scriptures. And once you sort of allow yourself to kind of be invaded almost by like the power of the Hebrew scriptures, and especially the Psalms, and like you say, some of the laments of the prophets, and then you read the New Testament again, it's like reading the New Testament for the first time.
Absolutely.
Like, oh wow. And you and then when you go to Mass and you start to see all the Jewish connections in the Mass, and you're like, you can, if you strip Jewishness, that background of the Jewish religion from Christianity, you just don't have Christianity anymore.
No, well, even the prayer, the preparation for the Eucharistic prayer and everything. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, you have. That's a variation of Jewish prayers. And it's just so inexplicable to, inexplicable. I understand to some degree how that phenomenon happens of the split, and of people harboring negative attitudes and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting to me because it goes back to our topic here too, that it's just more factions of like, this is the way, like, okay. This
is the way. And it's like, what is the way?
Right. Who gets to say?
Yeah, it is interesting that they never really give us hardly any specifics of what is in the Mandalorian Creed. And is this all oral tradition? I know in Legends, the Mandalorians actually had some written scriptures, like the Super Commando Codex and a few other things like that. I don't know if that's been grandfathered in.
That'd be a good question. I'm not sure.
That's my one quibble. I would have liked to have seen, because now I'm really interested in this stuff. I want to know what their theology really is. I almost think that the Mandalorians must be a theistic culture because of how focused it is on atonement.
Right.
How like they have this sense of sin, of having offended a power that is beyond you, created you, keeps you in being. That you have to rightly orient yourself to that reality that underlies the entire universe, and that's atonement. I just feel like they must be a theistic. They never mention a god, but I feel
Well,
almost like it must be just implicit.
it's got to be, and it's got to be kind of at the heart of. Well, I was thinking of this. It's kind of an interesting connection. Obi-Wan is my favorite Star Wars character today, at least. Sometimes it changes, but no, he tends to be my favorite character for different reasons. But he sadly is someone who says one of the stupidest lines in all of Star Wars that drives me nuts, which is namely, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes," which is ironic because that's an absolute statement, but we won't get into that. Well, what are you going to do? But, and it wasn't, to be fair, it wasn't Obi-Wan who wrote that. It was George Lucas. But here's a good example of like, well, the Mandalorians aren't Sith, and they're, these guys at least are incredibly absolutist, but in a good way, because I think like in season 3, I'm thinking of, I just really love that exchange. We talked about this. I actually hosted, when we did the breakdown of episode 7, The Spies, which I don't know if you had mentioned this or someone else. I think actually Josh Beagley, I think, got this from a friend, or he saw this somewhere and shared it with us after that episode, because we were all kind of like, who are the spies? And I know there was a lot of going around, and it wasn't until after that somebody was like, well, in the Old Testament, because why don't we just keep going back there? They said when they wanted to
sent into the
they
promised
wanted to
land,
scout out the promised land, so they sent spies in. So they said, I think just all the Mandalorians who went to Mandalore in that episode are spies. And I'm like, oh, well, perfect. I'm good. I was like,
those who have to scout out the land, and what they do, they bring back a bad report,
right?
And
it's pretty bad. I'm like, I like that.
One of those people was Caleb, right?
Yeah, Caleb. Joshua and Caleb
Caleb. If I'm remembering my Old Testament properly, was not originally one of the people of Israel.
Right.
He was kind of adopted in.
Yeah,
and made
that's actually a good
part
point.
of one of the tribes.
Yeah,
not like a foundling from birth or anything, but he's not originally an Israelite, but he becomes an Israelite.
Just looking here quick, I forget what people he was from. He wasn't a Canaanite, I don't think, but he was.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Kadesh. Well, I mean, Caleb's Hebrew name, but he's Book of Numbers, Canaan. I don't know. Well, I'll look it up later. You know what? Why should we do all the work? You folks out there, if you want to know where Caleb came from, but no, he is. Yeah, that's a great point though. That he's someone who, comes into this and is welcomed in. Which again, that's like a proto-Christian thing, of course, there too. The idea that this is a dispensation that is for more than just a particular ethnic group. Which and that's interesting to me too. I hadn't thought of that. That the very nature, this is something I want to throw this out at you. I'm kind of jumping around a few things here, but I thought it was neat in that episode that most people were at least a little like, with, if not downright really upset. I was more of the former than the latter myself, because I love Jack Black, but.
I thought that episode was funny.
Yeah, the Jack Black Lizzo thing, like I was like, well, whatever, come on. Like
they're gonna do celebrity cameos. I'm like, okay,
fair enough. But the fight at the end, like the real kind of key moment at that, when she gets the Darksaber, where she goes against Axe Woves and everything. And what I thought was really interesting about that crew, like those Mandalorian mercenaries, is how uniform they all were. And these are supposedly like, these are the ones who are like more open-minded. They have their helmets off all the time, and they're more lax from the perspective of the Children of the Watch Mandalorians. But I thought that was kind of interesting that at the end of the day, though, these are the ones that are like, they're very uniform, same color, everybody looks the same, even though their helmets are off.
Unit. Yeah.
Right. Like their helmets are off. You can see their individuality facially, but they don't really act individual. Where ironically enough, the Children of the Watch Mandalorians, who are like the more uniform and they never take their helmets off, there's so much diversity there.
I believe that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it
that
had
was an
to be
intentional way of contrasting them.
But that was an interesting thing too, just from the standpoint of like, here you have these two disparate groups, but ironically enough, the one that's supposedly more rigid and more Pharisaical, by the same token, they're the ones who constantly, like, they seem to fuel their ranks, not through procreation, ostensibly, because they don't ever take their uniforms. I don't want to get into the details, but
Right.
like never take their helmets off. There's no like intimacy in the sort of that kind of that way, but there's this adoptive thing. Like, Din is the Mandalorian's Mandalorian, and he's not from Mandalore.
Yeah, that they mentioned that. What is it?
Right.
Axe Woves calls him out and says, "You have not a drop of Mandalorian blood in your veins." And I'm like, come on, man. You know about foundlings. Jango Fett was a foundling. And he's one of the most famous Mandalorians in history.
Yeah. And I thought that's such a neat thing that you think of like the whole debate in the early church about, the Gentiles. Like, no, not them. And it's like.
And do you have to be circumcised? Right.
And Jesus previewing that by saying, amen, I say to you, I have not found such faith in all of Israel. Tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven, and you're not, children of Abraham.
And what is it
step up to the plate?
In season 2, there's that episode, The Believer, where he takes off his helmet, and Din Djarin is the believer. Like you say, he's the Mandalorian's Mandalorian. He is a man of faith.
Yeah.
Through and through. He believes this. He believes in the creed. He believes in the traditions of his people. Yeah. He wants to raise his new son in these traditions, even though he's not human.
Yeah. Well, and I was so touched, and we talked about this in the SQPN shows and stuff too, but I just really, I was happy that the whole Bo-Katan arc in season 3, I really did not, I guess I didn't really think through what I really thought would happen with her in a whole lot of depth. Not that amount of depth, but like I was just really, I thought it was so cool to see like her reversion.
I was not expecting that.
Yeah.
I liked it a lot. Yeah.
And I thought of so many things with it, but just one that I'll mention is just that, when you are like, I don't want to get too specific with this, but like my own, sort of faith journey led me through a lot of wonderful experiences, a lot of suffering. Like we're all in the same boat in different ways with that. But, I was in the DC area. I was at Catholic U. I was really in that sort of DC hub in the early 2000s, like the first couple of years, 2002 to 2006. And, suffice it to say, like there were some folks that I had some very, close interaction with, that I served mass with, like there were leaders in the church in Washington, DC, who later, were exposed as tremendously wicked, people, and, Cardinal McCarrick was among them, and, I'd served mass with him. I've reflected in the wake of that, not patting myself on the back for being so holy, but rather than the standpoint of saying, God, like how did and why, like, how did you bring me through that and have it result in what it's resulted in? When
but for the grace of God,
in theory, that the very same grace, the very same influences are there for some of these other people who are so wicked and that kind of thing. And I had my moments where I would be tempted to feel a little jaded, or tempted to be like, well, how can I trust anything, But then you see the witness, right, of someone who is doing it right. And I forget who I heard say it one time, where it's like, I think it was Fulton Sheen who talked about this too. And others, I'm sure said the same thing, but I love that image of like, you don't judge the effectiveness of a medicine, by those who are not taking it correctly,
right.
And that really impacted me a lot, where there are so many people who are so hurt in the world and who abandon their faith because of the horrible behavior, or even the abuse, or whatever the most extreme case might be, of someone who supposedly is the real deal. And I really felt like in some ways, maybe I was reading into it much, but I felt that with Bo-Katan, that here's like, she's so just jaded, and just like, she's sitting on that throne at the beginning of the season, right? And just like, whatevs, but by the end of it, she's like rediscovered this faith. Like she's so authentic, more than we've ever seen her, even in animation, and I thought that was so well done. And I didn't hear a lot of people talking about that.
I liked when she leads Din down to the, or I guess his first name is Djarin, actually.
I'm wondering now. Yeah, now I'm all like,
if Din from his original planet is Din a surname. But anyway,
Din Djarin, yeah.
She leads Din Djarin down to where the sacred waters are. And she's talking about going through the motions as a teenager.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that reminds me of a lot of my peers who went through confirmation class.
Right. And she's ridiculing it. Remember, she reads the plaque and she's like,
she's like, oh, whatever.
This was a mythosaur lair. Like,
and
okay.
I took the creed. My dad was so proud. Everyone wanted to see the princess taking the creed. I'm like, wow, she's so jaded. Like, yeah, she's like, a lot of, people who,
Well, a lot of Jews after their bar mitzvah or
a
bat
lot of
mitzvah, a
Catholics
lot of
after
Catholics.
confirmation. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like,
right. It's like graduation.
it's like
You know?
graduation, and she's like, and now I don't have to have anything to do with that ever again.
Yeah.
And she becomes, I believe that episode's called The Convert. She
Mm-hmm.
becomes, she becomes iffy about taking off her helmet.
Yeah.
And she starts trying to live by the creed, by the way.
But for us Christians too, like the takeaway there of like, what is it that really seems to connect with her? Because I was thinking of that. It's like the example of people who just keep trying and trying to do it the right way and really walk the walk, and the fellowship, like the welcome she gets. Here she's been like completely like abandoned by all those people that were so loyal to her, and she's just all by herself, has nothing.
Right. Yeah.
And then they're like, welcome.
Welcome.
You've also been
part
redeemed.
of our community. Yeah.
And they're all patting her on the back, and she's like, what? Like,
you're not going to abandon me like the others.
So that's, I think, a lesson for us too. Like, when that person, like Jesus is, I try to get across this to my students a lot too. Like, I always like to tell them, like, yes, Jesus loves you just the way you are, but, and he'll come to you wherever you're at, but he loves you way too much to just leave you there. Right. He also says, go and sin no more. Mm-hmm. Like there is, there's tasks, there's expectations, but what I love about this, I really got the impression from this season that Catholic thing of like, yeah, the stakes are really high, the emphasis on sin and the darkness and the situation. Yeah, sure, we got to really hit that home. But man, is the mercy unfathomable. Like severe punishment, but immediate slate wiped clean the moment you show any repentance.
Right. Yeah.
And it's so like, you're the apostate. But did you do the thing? Did you repent? Oh yeah, welcome back.
Oh yeah, yeah,
right.
Yeah, and that's another thing with like there's very much the sense of the very early church with the Mandalorians. Yeah. And not only was the early church, we know from the Acts of the Apostles, called the Way,
right?
But also this sense of sort of, especially with the Mandalorians who are still both with the coverts who are scattered throughout the galaxy, they live underground. And the Mandalorians who were still left on Mandalore living underground, that immediately hit me like, oh, Christians in the catacombs.
Yeah. Absolutely. For very practical reasons in some sense, but just, it's...
Yeah, they're persecuted by an empire. They have foundlings. Yep. Or the early church was very protective of innocent life, whereas in Greco-Roman culture, if you had a baby who was deformed, or let's just even say, I didn't want a girl, you left the baby out into the elements to die, whereas Christian communities would routinely look for foundlings, bring them in, raise them, and this was viewed by the authorities as nonconformist behavior.
Right.
Like, look at these weirdos who rescued children,
Yeah, these like, why would you do that? Like, these are so weak and useless,
Which in a society as focused on power as Roman society was, they really didn't have a lot of place for weakness.
Right.
Whereas the Christian message is, my strength is made perfect in weakness.
Yeah.
We worship a God who was weak so that we could become strong. Right.
Well, and that goes to Din's struggle here too with the whole helmet thing, because it's like, the need to do this thing that is forbidden, but he's doing it out of the love, out of the core principles of the code that he's trying to follow, right? Which was funny because
loyalty.
And it's I love these the texture of all of this and how it leads to these discussions, because it's the same sort of thing with Anakin's whole discussion with Padme, right? When they're going to Naboo and he's protecting her in episode 2, and she's they're talking about the Jedi code, and she says he says can't do this, can't do that, or can't like with the people I love or something, and she says like are you allowed to love? And he has that whole thing that he's really clearly thought it through. Like he's been thinking about it. He's not just rattling it off to impress her, but that his perspective on, the Jedi Order resists attachment, but insists on devotion and sacrifice and what he calls love, and that they are
resist
commanded to love
attachment to
and
free themselves
right.
for a greater self-sacrificial love. I
right.
think.
Yeah. And it is interesting because a lot of people, this is not really our topic here so much, but it's why I think a lot of people were confused or challenged a little bit, by that choice that Luke gave Grogu in Book of Boba Fett with the whole like Jedi or family, and kind of adhering to that when Luke himself is like the direct recipient, he is the advancement of the lesson learned of all of that with it's his father's sacrifice for him that saved the day, that you'd think he'd maybe think a little twice about, does this have to be a celibacy thing, or can there be room for family attachment and we work with that so it's not,
Right.
And I don't know, even in Christianity, you see, of course, we have the discipline of the celibate priesthood, which I have no problem with or argument against whatsoever, but to recognize also that isn't the only, legitimate way to approach that we have the Eastern tradition and
Eastern Catholics,
and so but yeah, I love, again, I love all these themes coming together and seeing it just felt so organic. It didn't feel forced when these two factions came together. Like it made sense within the story.
And the whole inclusion of all of these themes and motifs did not feel forced.
Right.
It felt organic. And honestly, I was kind of blown away that I'm like, okay, Disney, giant evil mega corporation,
not exactly a friend of the Catholic Church or Jewish Orthodox faith, and right.
Yeah, that you're going to present in a popular, wide audience television show.
Yeah.
That faith, creed, ritual, liturgical, sacramental worldview has a positive
absolutes
have a positive influence on a culture, whereas in almost the sort of modernist and postmodernist narrative that you see in almost every other movie and television show out there is religion equals ignorant superstition.
Yep.
And that's pretty much hands down all you see, except for The Mandalorian.
Right. And even to the extent that you see a premium placed on some vague sense of togetherness and community, it's to my eye, most of the time, it's basically some form of, at the core of it, it's still an atomized kind of thing. It's individual based. And can't we all just get along?
Right.
Rather than, and that's not what this is. Like every one of these people is sacrificing all the time, and that's, I loved Din's speech to Bo in the Spies episode with the whole, like, she's focused on the Darksaber and he says, just very dismissively, right? Very dispassionate, like everything I know about this weapon you taught me, to be honest, doesn't mean anything to me. My people, like, we care about honor, character, loyalty.
I love that speech.
It's everything he lists is about going out, transcending self.
Yeah. And that thing, everybody's got to serve somebody, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm going to serve you because I think you
to the death.
To the death, yeah. Which is, but contravened.
Oh my gosh!
Very happily, all of my expectations for how this was going to go.
Me too.
I thought they were going to come to blows over the Darksaber.
Yeah.
And that Din Djarin would become Mandalore.
Yeah.
He would become the next Mandalore, the wielder of the Darksaber. Not only, they completely, overturned expectations.
Yeah. Well, they took that off the table too.
They took it off the table completely,
which I think is good in a way. Yeah.
Good for the Mandalorians. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think now they can move on from this idea that leadership means having this token.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and that was even directly challenged by Gideon with that line about, like, Mandalorians are weak without their trinkets.
And she says we are stronger together. Mm-hmm. But like you said, a real togetherness.
Right.
A sacrificing of one for the other, of self-gift, giving of self, not this kind of like oh, we're all together because of bland toleration.
Right,
We
or like
tolerate one another.
some collective, like it's just a lot of people collectively pooling the will to power, like the Nietzschean kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's like, no, this is
That's Gideon.
It's communion, right? Gideon, yeah, he's like back to the Tolkien thing. He's Saruman, right? Wheels, gears,
Wheels
and
and
wheels
engines, and how he's
engines
like,
yeah.
I'll absorb all these things I admire about these other cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
it's like a parasite.
By
or
a
something.
parasite, while in the process destroying those cultures. I was
it's a zero-sum game for him,
which brought to my mind where he's like, that's the opposite of what the Catholic Church, seeks to do with evangelization of other cultures.
Right.
Where we don't take what's best in them. We encourage those cultures to live those parts of you that are best, that were put there by God as seeds of the gospel.
Right.
Be authentically whatever it is, Mesoamerican or Chinese or Indian or whatever, because we have all these different expressions,
right.
Filipino, African, in the church. I love watching on YouTube videos of mass from other parts of the world.
Oh yeah.
And just seeing how I'm like, this is so authentically them, yet it's unmistakably Catholic.
I think Father Mitch Pacwa liked to point that out years ago in a homily I was listening to by him, where he pointed out like different rites, right? The different like autocephalous churches and stuff in the broader Catholic Church, and like you said, Maronites, Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malabar, Chaldean, and he pointed out that when you look at all those different rites, it shouldn't surprise us that there's that much difference, like that. That's what really kind of that's what you'd expect, so to speak, because we're all from different parts of the world and all this.
Right.
But he'd like to point out, but like what's incredible is at the end of the day, Mass is the same everywhere. Doesn't matter what it looks like, because it's, gather, confess sins, proclaim the word, bring forth gifts, consecrate the Eucharist, and then send. However you do that, all these different ways that's been expressed. So that common theme. What I'm really interested to see is, when we pick up with season 4, we didn't talk about maybe getting to predictions, and I don't know if that's jumping here too much, but I don't really have any other than to say I kind of like that the sort of like the game board's been reset, so to speak.
They could have ended it here.
They could, and people are speculating. I did a little bit too, like, oh, maybe Gideon's clones. That's possible, but I think he should be gone, because my argument is this was third time's the charm, right? Because he escaped season 1. He escaped after season 2. I feel like narratively it makes sense in that regard to close this with him, but there's still room for the story to continue, assuming that, of course, a lot of the stuff they're going to bring up with Ahsoka, because I feel like they've really been building up to Thrawn being the far more significant, villain in a lot of ways, but yeah, I don't know, just maybe punch that over to you here to see if is there any, especially with what we've been talking about, like, is there anything you think that you might expect, or you wouldn't be surprised to see some version of, given these biblical motifs, moving into this final season before the final season before the film event?
I think that, I don't know if this is a prediction or just something I would like to see, now that they've reclaimed the land, essentially. They've returned to the promised land, to Mandalore. Now they sort of need to be sent, because you know how Christ tells the apostles at the ascension, look, go back to Jerusalem, the holy city, the temple, the focal point of Jewish life. Go back to Jerusalem, and from there I'm going to send you out. I think in some way the Mandalorians need to reintegrate into wider galactic culture. They can't just sit there segregated on their planet. They need to. Then obviously they need to rejuvenate Mandalore.
It's almost it's like the broader implication, right? The broader lesson that they've been learning internally of, like, okay, children of the Watch and night owls, and like, we can get along. maybe we can get along with Chandrillans. maybe we can get along with, people from Sullust, Wookiees. Like, yeah, there is kind of which Din is already doing a little bit, right? Like he's getting over his droid thing, but he seems to have this familiarity because of his adventures.
I love the whole arc of the Mandalorians from the time of the Old Republic, and I mean the Old Republic, until now, because in the Old Republic era, they were a pretty vaguely Sith adjacent faction. And to kind of see them move to be kind of almost Jedi adjacent faction has been just, I love that as an arc, because you can see why, as a warrior culture, initially they would be attracted to the Sith. But then they had, Tar Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi. And I
don't think he's the last.
I don't think he's the last. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that prediction, that's what I want.
Yeah.
Of Grogu kind of integrating those two aspects of his life.
Well, and I think it's so brilliant because he could have been a lot of different races. Like, you could have made him an Ewok. You could have made him all kinds of things that would have been cute. Why is he Yoda species?
Yeah.
Like, it's not. I really don't believe it's just random, because that was such a
with Dave
protected
Filoni,
thing.
it's not. There's a reason.
I think part of it has to be connected to the longevity, because you open, and not just for a gimmick. They're like, well, we can keep telling these stories forever.
Yeah.
I imagine like him being able to singularly transcend generations of these people, and for himself to be learning as he goes, but also being this almost like a cultural artifact.
Right.
And this connection directly back to the Jedi, not just he's heard about them, but he's then old enough to also have come from the temple. And then like he connects all these, there's so much they can do with it.
In a way, he's
I trust
kind
Dave
of
Filoni.
he's bringing the Jedi, kind of how Tar Vizsla went off and became a Jedi.
Right.
And he, they eventually, I believe the Mandalorians ended up stealing the Darksaber from the temple.
Yeah.
But in this case, the Jedi is sort of coming to them and introducing into their culture things that they need to truly advance as a people.
Yeah. Well, and giving them a place in there again, and there's no mistake that there's those two, like the line was identical. The quote, from Din both times when Grogu does the flip and like wins that little paintball battle, right? And then she says like, "Wow, when'd you teach him that?" And he's like, "He didn't learn that from me.
He didn't learn it from me." Yeah.
Well, he learned that from Luke, and we all know that, And then later on, of course, with the breaking up the fight, right, being the peacemaker, right?
Peacemaker, blessed are the peacemaker.
And she specifically says like it can't be from either of the factions. Like they're stuck. They're in this like, it can't be me, it can't be you, and then all of a sudden, but he can do it because he's different, And then again, like she's like, he didn't learn that from me, and that's Jedi, so
and it's straight from Isaiah too. The lion shall lay down with the lamb, and the little child shall lead them.
Yes,
which I think circling back to the book, I believe that's the quote we use at the front piece of the book.
That sounds familiar. Yeah,
a little child shall lead them. Isaiah 11:6.
For those who don't believe it, there it is, right there. No, this is like, I'm getting fired up because this is like, again, we saw, you typed up these notes here, and I've been thinking about this. We've been talking about this, but it's I think we're gonna have to bring it home a little bit just for this iteration. But I definitely want to pick. There's different ways I want to pick this up in the future with you too. If you want to come back on, I would love to have you back on to talk about it, Thomas.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And definitely as we see this, you mentioned, they're building up to this big crossover movie. I'm sure, with Dave Filoni at the helm, and he just has to see, him and Jon Favreau have in their bones somehow this more sort of biblical vocabulary that George Lucas, while he had ideas about redemption, he didn't he was too, I think, maybe he was a little bit jaded about Christianity. I don't know, but
I think he was very, very much in the Joseph Campbell mindset, I think, which maybe more than, because it's become vogue, right, to just be like, oh yes, Joseph Campbell, and like, well, okay, but like that wasn't really like something everybody was just rattling off back in the 60s, in the early 70s when he was doing this. So that was pretty unique, I think. But it's not exactly, a biblical worldview, let's just say.
No, yeah.
So
I took, on Amazon how they let you look at the first few pages of a book.
yeah.
I tried reading the little excerpt of Campbell's book on the Grail.
Oh,
and I was
okay.
immediately like, no, he doesn't get Christianity. He really doesn't. But in any case, like, I think as we're building up to this big crossover movie, and we're going to get things like Ahsoka and, continuing to follow the stories of people like Din Djarin and Boba Fett and Bo-Katan, I think we're going to get more and more of these motifs and this kind of storytelling in the future. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Well, Thomas, as always, thank you so much for coming on the show again, and I think people will enjoy this chat, no doubt. There's a lot to digest here, so we'll have to have you back.
Thank you so much, Mike. May the Force be with you.
And with your spirit. There it is. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. And as usual, after we stopped the recording, we continued to chat for like another 15 or 20 minutes about all kinds of things and book recommendations, and we had to stop, because I said to him at one point, I was like, we should have just recorded this and had a second episode of something completely different. So he will be back. Thomas, I always enjoy my time talking with him and being able to share these conversations with you all. So God bless you all. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. Again, if you haven't, share it far and wide. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.